Hello, I'm Jeanne Meserve, and we are back with episode 4 of Reimagining American Democracy. Over the past few months, we've explored some of the fundamentals of American democracy, including recent battles over voting rights and possible approaches to reining in toxic disinformation. Today, we'll be speaking to experts and elected officials about another aspect of democracy, election security. This is, of course, in part technical. How, for instance, do you prevent hacks of voting machines? But it is also about the increasing polarization of the American electorate and what that has done to faith in democracy. According to a recent CNN poll, 56% of Americans feel that American democracy is under attack. And 51% say it is likely that elected officials in the US will successfully overturn the results of a future election if their party does not win. This is another threat to American democracy. We will be discussing it over the next hour. This series was made possible by a cross-partisan group of nonprofit organizations, including Freedom House, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, the George W. Bush Institute, and Issue One. Before we bring in our guests, a word from series co-host Holly Kuzmich, Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute.
I'm Holly Kuzmich, Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute. On behalf of my colleagues at the Institute and our esteemed partners at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, Issue One, and Freedom House, welcome to Reimagining American Democracy. This is the 4th episode in a series that seeks solutions to some of the most urgent challenges facing American democracy today. Over the past several months, we've featured experts from across the political spectrum: the mayors of Atlanta and Birmingham, the secretaries of state of Kentucky, Maine, and Georgia, leaders at Facebook, NPR, and at top advocacy organizations, including a former US Secretary of State. Today, we're covering election security, and we're looking for pragmatic answers that strengthen voter confidence in our democracy. In the spirit of a civil cross-partisan debate, we hope you'll make your voice heard too. Our hashtag is Democracy Reimagined. Thank you so much to our speakers, and thank you for being here to join this critical conversation.
Thank you, Holly. And as Holly mentioned, we want all of you to participate in this conversation. This is democracy after all. Please use the Q&A window that you see on Zoom, and we will get in as many of your questions as we possibly can. Now, let me introduce our first panel to discuss the security of the US election system. We have with us for this panel Yasmin Green. She is Director of Research and Development at Google Jigsaw. Also with us is Commissioner Thomas Hicks of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. Thank you both for being with us. The first thing I'd like to do is go back to those statistics that I cited in the open, and specifically the second one, which said that 51% say it is likely that elected officials will successfully overturn the results of a future election if their party does not win. Commissioner Hicks, let me start with you. Is that a valid fear?
It is not. Elections are run by people who love our democracy. And I believe that the people who do this not for the money. They're doing this for the passion of ensuring that we are not a third world nation, that these are not the ideals that we have been striding for over 250 years. So I don't think that the 51% from that survey will be correct with that. As we saw with the last election, when one person tried to overturn results going through the court system and having recounts, the recounts are the way that these are validated. So you can't overturn something that's been validated.
Yasmin, do you want to weigh in on that question?
I mean, just to piggyback on what Commissioner Hicks said, I think that really highlights the difference, the difference and importance of like perception versus reality. We still have a problem if people perceive that to be a risk.
Commissioner, let me come back to you. There obviously are guardrails that have prevented elected officials from simply overturning election results. But some people have expressed concern that those guardrails have been weakened, that they're eroding. Do you share that concern?
To some degree, yes. But I believe that as I travel around the country and talk to elected officials about running the elections, that they have a true passion that they are doing the right thing, and that there are guardrails in place. So even if some of those are weakened, I think that they will not fully, be implemented and show that or overturn any election, legitimate election. I also think that it's imperative that we get more people involved in these elections. For instance, poll workers. We need over 1 million people to serve as poll workers across the country during a presidential election year. And they can see from the inside how things are run, and that this is not some sort of scam.
Are you concerned, Commissioner, though, that partisans are taking up those positions? There's a push to do that.
Partisans have always pushed for their party to, no one wants to admit that they've lost. No one wants to not be the popular kid. So I think that partisans have always pushed this, but in running an election, there are safeguards in place so that one party can't really push the overturning of an election without the legitimate weighing in from either the courts or laws that are in place from each individual state.
Yasmin, these statistics appear to tell us that people think that the democratic process is corrupt or is corruptible. What role is disinformation playing in diminishing faith in US democracy?
Yeah, so my team, just for a bit of context, it's called Jigsaw, within the kind of semi-autonomous within the broader Google ecosystem, but we look a lot at mis and disinformation across platforms and the internet, not exclusively on elections, but of course the election context is so important, high stakes, and also rapidly evolving. So I think we have disinformation, which we define as intentionally misleading information, certainly, and also accidental misinformation, which is inevitable in a fast-paced, changing environment where votes are being counted in different places at different time, and so there is a gap, an educational gap for all of us to kind of understand how the election process works in the first place, when to expect definitive results to come in, not the night of election voting. And to understand the risks. And then, as election misinformation narratives are kind of seeded, to make sure that we're there early and armed. So go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Well, just that I was going to, maybe getting into the weeds a bit quickly here, but, my team looks at kind of the suite of tools that we have today to help people online, especially, be equipped to kind of evaluate the trustworthiness of information. They are really important, but there are some shortcomings. And so we're interested in potential innovations in how we can help users or people rather, navigate misinformation safely.
So there are a lot of people who are wedded to this disinformation. They don't want to hear fact correction. Is it possible to reach those people?
There are the unreachables in any debate. I would now kind of diving into what we have today, the techniques that we saw a lot of the platforms use to try to help people understand when they're being presented by mis or disinformation, sometimes by political leaders or I suppose leaders of influence that we would hope would not be spreading misinformation. They were fact checking and labeling. So fact checking is really important. You're debunking a false claim. For many people, as you're reaching the people who are less reachable, once they have a pre-existing belief, it's really difficult to bring them back. And the drawback is actually, the downside isn't just that it doesn't work. It's actually that they start to distrust all the vehicles by which that corrective information is arriving. So I think that's the area that we have a lot more work to do, is to say for the group of, segment of Americans that distrust the establishment or traditional institutions that we've trusted in the past, how can we reach them?
And is there a way to inoculate people against disinformation before they're exposed to it?
Yeah, that's a That's a great segue for me, this notion of inoculation. I've heard it, just to tie it to fact checking or debunking. I've heard inoculation described as pre-bunking. And the research shows that people are misinformation sticky, especially if it gets to you before the correction. If you can flip that over, especially if you can alert people to an attempt to manipulate them. No one likes to be manipulated. They have their guard up, their defense up. And then when they get the propaganda or the disinformation, they're much more resilient to it.
I'd like to get you both to weigh in on this question, on what impact you think a Trump 2024 run might have on the disinformation ecosystem. Yasmin, you want to take that first?
Well, I mean, I think the 2016 election, the major theme for combating disinformation was this idea of foreign election meddling, cross-border, election interference or misinformation. Before 2016, that wasn't really something that we were well aware of or well equipped to tackle as online platforms. That's since changed. There are now policies and teams staffed up, and there are really effective detection mechanisms. And what's going to be, what was different in 2020 was that, the so-called core was coming from within the House. I expect that to continue to be the case in 2024, and even more people actually believing in the misinformation. So it's not this case that there are these, ill-intentioned misinformation spreaders. Of course there are, but there are going to be so many people that continue to believe the so-called big lie from 2020. So it makes, I think, the misinformation challenge even thornier.
Commissioner Hicks, do you want to weigh in on that, the Trump
Sure.
impact on disinformation?
Sure, I would go back, and I want to jump on with Ms. Green was saying as well, of in 2016, when we had the foreign influence of a foreign government trying to influence our elections, the EAC worked with a few governmental agencies, and the Department of Homeland Security came up with designating elections as critical infrastructure. Because before 2016, there was no real way for the government to, other than the EAC, but for DHS to talk to election officials quickly. They would get to the folks who were the IT people in particular states, but they weren't getting to the election officials, and therefore not getting information to them quickly, and therefore squashing some of these things. So I think as we move towards 22 and 24, things have been put in place to battle misinformation and disinformation, but we can't combat all of it.
Explain to us what the U.S. Election Assistance Commission is.
We are a bipartisan agency formed after the Help America Vote Act in 2002, after what happened down in Florida in the 2000 election. Our main role is to serve election officials and voters to help improve the process. So in 2020, we gave out $825 million in CARES and HAVA grants so that election officials can improve the process, basically buying PPEs, purchasing new voting equipment, high-speed scanners, and so forth. We also give out products, basically, so information, so basically a checklist on things that election officials should be doing to ensure that the election runs smoothly and things like that. And
what is the role, explain for those who don't understand, the role of the federal government in elections as opposed to the states and locals?
Well, the states run the elections, the locals run the elections, but for federal elections, under the time, place, and manner clause of the Constitution, the federal government gets a say in that. And so basically our role is to help improve that process to make sure the election runs smoothly.
And I'm just curious if your work has shifted at all since the 2020 election. Has the focus changed?
Nope, our focus has always been the same, working with election officials and advocates and voters to ensure that people, one, have the ability to register to vote, have their votes cast, and then have those votes counted correctly.
And I want to get to the technical aspects of elections, which deal with all of that in just a moment, but we do have a couple of audience questions. Let me work those in. Teresa asks, I wonder if anything can be done to better educate, advise, or market the facts about how elections are done. Is there a shift in governmental priorities to shift money to doing this locally? Is there any evidence that identifies who the average voter trusts for this information? Commissioner, that sounds like it could be one for you.
I would love if I had, a magic, wand to start with elementary school, to basically go back to civics and teach children and students how our government actually works, and then work towards educating people as they get older, but also have people serve as poll workers and serve as elected officials so they can see it from the inside. It's really easy to say that this is not working if you have no touch with it, or if you don't go to the LNA, or basically the logic and accuracy testing that every state authorizes for voting machines. So they look at these machines, they're basically just calculators. You press one button and it adds, that sort of thing. So I would go towards that, of educating folks as much as possible.
Yasmin, who do voters trust for this information?
I mean, that's a inspired question from Teresa. I just say I love Commissioner Hicks' idea about having people volunteer, and also just from the social media platforms too, to go there and we had the benefit of spending time with local election officials via a convening by Harvard Belfer Center. And I was so inspired by how talented and motivated, passionate these individuals are. And also just recognizing that the more local you get, and typically trust and kind of proximity move together. I'm most trusting of the officials that I know, most closely, and most distrusting of the officials that are farthest away. Those people who are the most trusted are the least well-resourced. So when you go to somebody who's in such a small area that there are just a handful of election officials there, to say, well, you should have a rapid response, social media strategy plan, was kind of laughable, because they barely have enough resources to do what, their core mandate. So I think bringing us closer together, the stakeholders, so that we can be really working in ways that, handing the baton over in ways that they can be received.
Commissioner, I do want to talk about the technology. A lot of money has been spent on upgrading voting machines and the like. What vulnerabilities remain?
I believe that the biggest vulnerability is disinformation, that these machines are not functioning in the way that they were intended. Back in February of this year, my fellow commissioners, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, voted unanimously to upgrade the standards used for testing voting equipment, the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines 2.0. And those are being implemented as we speak. And hopefully the manufacturers can build toward those more rigorous standards for the voting equipment. We're not looking back at 1980. Like if you had I've been around my kids too long. If you look back to 1980 with a computer, that computer does not have the same security as something that you would purchase in 2021. And so we see the same sort of things with voting equipment. The voting equipment that you used and purchased 30 years ago is not going to be as secure and accurate and not accurate, but more robust as something that you purchase today.
But for instance, are there still localities where they're using voting machines that don't leave a paper trail?
There are some localities that do have that, but there are still other safeguards put into place. So for instance, people aren't allowed to vote twice. And then you actually get to, those machines are still regulated either by the state or through the EAC in terms of, but it's a lot fewer states in 2020 than were in 2018 who had paperless voting equipment.
There also has been concern that election websites could be hacked and tampered with, and that could erode confidence in vote totals. What progress is being made there? What progress needs to be made there?
Well, that's not something that the EAC works on in particular in terms of the websites overall. But what we say to election officials is, or to voters, is to make sure that they go to the websites. Do not go towards third-party groups for results and so forth. Go to the actual source. And so we hope that as we live in this, cyber world, websites are going to be attacked, but we hope that if they are attacked, that they are brought back up and running as quickly as possible and damage is minimal.
Yasmin, I saw you nodding during that answer. Do you want to chime in?
Oh, just because I think there are some types of election information, like just where to go for the authoritative source. Like there will not be an authoritative outcome until it is delivered on this site. That's the type of thing that there really isn't a downside risk to communicating more emphatically and more broadly, versus maybe some of the other things that are meeting people at their pre-existing beliefs and might create friction. So just lots of room for improvement there on the information front.
Commissioner, one other question about technology. We're seeing articles now about insider threats, about partisan election officials who are giving away passwords and other sorts of proprietary information that can compromise voting machines. How big is that problem and what can be done about it?
I don't think that's a big problem at all, because the passwords that are being shared should not be like password 123 or something like that. And I would have the question of, what are those passwords for? Is it for the upgrading of those machines? If that's the case, then those are bipartisan teams that are used to upgrade those machines, and that there should never be one person working on a machine alone. It should always be teams and having safeguards put in place. I would add that I like the fact that, I don't know which group came out with it, which social media group came out with it yesterday, that they were going to take down misinformation about the vaccine. But I would hope, I would hope that would also be the case for election issues in 22 and 24. So that if they see misinformation, that they take that down immediately.
Yasmin, there's also a human part of infrastructure, and I believe that Google Jigsaw has done surveys of local election officials. I'm wondering what you found in those surveys that's either of concern or might be comforting.
I mean, the work, our closest work with local election officials was, like 4 or 5 years ago now. But really, what we took away was the ambition, because people get into that job for to protect them, to build and help protect American democracy, but not necessarily the technical know-how on the information side, nor the kind of physical people to do it. But I was inspired to see who we have on the front lines. If we could equip them a bit better to do their job, then we'd all be a lot better off.
We have another viewer question here. I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on whether they think open source election software would help with the reality and perception of election security. Either one of you want to weigh in on that?
I do know that there was a professor down at the University of Florida who has an open source voting equipment that's been used in a couple of states. But I think that if they want to submit that to the EAC for certification, I would be more than willing to, hopefully our certification team could take a look at that and get it out there, so that if there are bugs in the system, that the folks can solve those bugs as quickly as possible.
State legislatures obviously are considering and enacting various measures that supporters say would increase voter security. I'd like to quickly go through those and get your thoughts. First, voter ID cards. Improve security? Commissioner, why don't you take that?
I don't believe that does improve security. It gives a false narrative that there are other safeguards in place to identify people.
False narrative. Yasmin, this is your alley. Is there a lot of disinformation swirling about identification cards, about mail-in ballots and the like?
Yeah, certainly. And while this conversation's centered around the US elections, we look across the world and we see those, that disinformation being seeded so early. And so that actually creates challenges for the inoculation strategy, because you're trying to reach people before the misinformation. But if you look at a country like Brazil, the narrative about faulty voting machines has been seeded so early, just in case it needs to be activated at election time, to challenge the credibility of the vote.
What about, Commissioner, limitations on early voting? Is that going to improve election security?
I don't believe so, but I know that in 2020, when we were dealing with the pandemic, a lot of states went to early voting and mail-in ballots, and that helped with getting people involved in the process, and all those things are verified. So Early voting is something that I think aids in allowing for people not to be stuck in a 10-hour line on election day. And it's something that the bipartisan Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsburg report came out in 2013 on.
But in that instance and in others, so often the right and left are not talking the same language when it comes to election security. And one of our viewers asked, Christopher asked, where on election security can the parties work together? What do you think?
Funding. Get funding out there. If you want better security, fund it so that we can get rid of these questions.
What kind of funding are you talking about?
If I could have my magic wand, it would be unlimited. But I think that R&D takes millions of dollars to get done. So
a couple of concluding questions. Yasmin, I'll kick this one to you first. Do you believe US elections are more or less secure today than they have been?
That's a little bit outside of my lane. I think that, I'll stick to the misinformation part, and Commissioner Hicks can talk to the more, hardcore security, is that I would say that the misinformation challenge is only greater because we don't have any black and white lines to draw as we did when it was a, foreign state actor.
Commissioner, your thoughts? More or less.
I've been working in elections for over 35 years, and I believe that they are more secure now than they were when I started working.
But the American public doesn't believe that. How do you get over that?
To be involved. You have to, you have to vote. You can't sit at home and not cast your ballot. But two, go when there are open houses by election officials to show how these machines work. Serve as a poll worker. Get information from a nonpartisan group so that you're not just listening to CNN or Fox. I wish that there was a Walter Cronkite out there still that could just give the information without any sort of tint towards it. Or look at our website on information that you need for voting, or go to the exact source, the election officials themselves.
Yasmin, last word to you. If there's one thing you could change about American democracy, this is, after all, reimagining American democracy, this program, what would you do?
I would have political figures and figures of influence take their position, be accountable or take responsibility for their position, because we're all trying, to manage the misperception fallout around the edges, but it's very difficult if we're not being helped by, the people who hold high office.
All right, we have to leave it there. Commissioner Hicks and Yasmin Green of Google Jigsaw, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
For having us.
We'll be back in just a moment with our second panel. All right, for our next live panel, U.S. elections on the front lines, let me welcome our three guests. We have Stephen Reed, who's the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, and a former member of the Department of Homeland Security's Election Integrity Commission. We have Arizona's Secretary of State, Katie Hobbs, and also Amber McReynolds, who's executive director of the National Vote at Home Institute. Thank you all three for being with us today, even from the Denver airport, in your case, Amber. It's a great background, by the way. So we have been looking with our previous guests at election security from the 30,000 foot level. You guys operate where the rubber really hits the road, and I want to get your perspective on some of this. Katie Hobbs, as Arizona's Secretary of State, you have really been in the middle of the firestorm during the recent recount of the 2020 results, now finally concluded. It was privately funded by pro-Trump forces, and it actually showed Joe Biden in the end with 99 more votes than he got in the official tally. Does this end the argument over election integrity in your state?
I certainly wish that it did, but the unfortunate answer is no, this is not over. And, a lot of folks are claiming victory. Like clearly this was all a sham and a waste of time since the results showed what we already knew. But the rest of the report is filled with misinformation, and it flags these things that they're calling anomalies, which really serve to perpetuate all of the conspiracy theories that are already out there about the election and are continuing to fuel claims of fraud. And the Senate president who oversaw this entire exercise has now called for investigations by the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is actually taking these calls seriously based on all of these unsubstantiated allegations that are easily explained by people who understand how our elections work. And this is such an unfortunate symptom of what we are continuing to face in terms of misinformation. And, alluding to the discussion earlier about trusted sources, the folks who are, invested in this so-called audit, this sham audit, really don't listen to those trusted sources. It's an extremely daunting place that we find ourselves right now.
Despite the results, it has triggered calls for other recounts in other states. I'm wondering, Secretary Hobbs, what message you might have for voters who are still skeptical about the 2020 election results?
Well, it does go back to the importance of getting information from trusted sources. And my office worked really hard throughout the election cycle to provide transparency into the processes so that voters understood and that they had the information they needed to exercise their freedom to vote and to do so safely. And we're going to continue to do that to try to cut through the noise. But if you're getting information about elections from anyone else, you can't be certain that it's valid. And a lot of this is perpetuated by people making some allegation and then it flies around the internet faster than we have our shoes on. And that is, we just have to keep combating that misinformation with the truth and do that continuously. And, as your previous panelist was talking about, those smaller, more local, more trusted officials, my office at the statewide level providing resources to those small county offices who don't have the resources to ensure that their voters are getting the information as well.
Mayor Reed, did voters in your city trust the election results?
Well, I think voters in my city trusted election results, and I think they trusted them in our county as well. I think that's because we've always been very vocal. We've been out front, in part because of the history of the Selma Montgomery Voting Rights March. It is taken a lot more seriously here. There's a year-round campaign, if you will, of information and participation that we have here. But, Montgomery is unique, and we understand that. Other parts of Alabama are probably a little bit different. And so we've been in the position, as myself being a former chief election official here, and now being the mayor, to be able to speak to a number of issues that are taking place both at precincts as well as the voting process itself, and obviously the outcome of these elections.
So the Alabama State Legislature has passed some new voting laws since the election. Do you believe the current emphasis on voter security is going to compromise voter access?
Oh, I think there's the blatant attempt to do that. I think there's no question this is an attempt to turn back the clock, if you will. This is an attempt to obstruct some of the progress that has been made since the civil rights movement. And I think it's very important for us to understand that the civil rights movement didn't take place last century. This took place in a lifetime of my parents and a lifetime of most of my family who's from this state. And so when we consider the progress that has happened here, it didn't just happen overnight, and it didn't happen generations ago. The late, great John Lewis said that the right to vote is sacred and it's precious, and we have to fight for it every day. And I think that's what we have to remember when we are seeing the things that are happening in legislatures across this nation. This is not, really a sideline sport, if you will. It's not a spectator sport. It's one that we have to actively engage in, and it's one that we have to actively fight for as we see things being deliberately undone to undermine the progress that's been made by so many who sacrifice for all of us to have the right to vote and all of us to make this democracy what it can be.
Now, Amber Reynolds, when we talk about voter access, we inevitably start talking about mail-in voting. First of all, why are you such an advocate for this? And two, do you think it's vulnerable to fraud, as has been alleged?
Sure. Well, thank you for that question, Jeannie. And I, as a former election official, I ran elections here in Denver, Colorado. Over time, what we saw in Colorado is voters were choosing to vote at home. And the reason is that it's secure, it's accessible, it's equitable, it's reliable, and it provides them more time to select their choices on the ballot, research issues on the ballot, spend time with their ballot that they wouldn't get at a polling place at home. And one story I'll share, I have an 8 and 10-year-old, I'm a single mom, and since my children could read, we have voted the ballot together. When my ballot comes, my kids say, Mom, when are we going to start working on this ballot? And it's a civics lesson for them every single time. So they ask me, what does mayor do? What does governor do? What does secretary of state do? And I can explain all of that to them at a young age. We spend days going through my ballot, but it's a civics lesson for them. So there are so many benefits to this method of voting. I truly do think it provides a more equitable, reliable, secure process. It provides voters more options. And voters are choosing it in record numbers across the country. Colorado obviously is one of a number of states now that are mailing a ballot every election. Utah is another one. Our neighbors to our west have been mailing ballots prior to 2020. They passed that legislation before. Nebraska has expanded vote by mail. So, you know, before the one kind of bully pulpit in 2020 was casting doubt on it, it's been expanding in red and blue states across the country because it's convenient, because it's secure. And, you know, the fraud allegations and things like that, voter fraud is exceedingly rare. The great thing is that every state has an ability at the election official level to catch bad actors when they try to take advantage of the system, and they're held accountable. And we need
the numbers are very low.
They are. I mean, when we look at the numbers, it's so exceedingly low. So this is not a major issue, but it's now being used as a major issue to change and restrict access for voters, which is not good.
So Secretary Hobbs, talked to us a little bit about what's happening in Arizona. I understand that 70% of the voters were automatically getting mail-in ballots, and the governor has just signed legislation that would reduce that number. Tell us what's happening and what you think's behind it.
So Arizona has basically an opt-in system where people can sign up for the permanent early voter list, and then they receive their ballot in the mail for every election that they're eligible to vote in. But if they don't want to vote by mail, then they can go to the polls, and they can do that earlier. They can go on election day. And this system has been so wildly successful in Arizona. Voters love that they have all of these options. They love the convenience of voting by mail. And I should add that both our first initial vote by mail, no excuse absentee voting, and the permanent early voter list were passed into law by Republican majority legislators. And now these very things are under attack by the Republican majority here. And so what the law that passed this year will do is knock people off of that permanent early voter list if they sit out for elections and not participate, but if they just choose to participate in with a mechanism other than their mail-in ballot. So if they got their mail-in ballot, but they decide they want to go to the polls instead, that action would mark them on the purge list. And so it's just changing a system that's worked so long and so well in Arizona. Every time you change something that people have finally gotten used to, it makes election officials' jobs harder in explaining voters, and it just has the potential to unintentionally disenfranchise a lot of voters.
But it's not kicking anybody off the voter rolls, we should emphasize, right? They won't get a mail-in, but they'll still be able to go to the polls. Right. Yeah, it's certainly not an entire vote purge. It's just a purge of people off of the permanent early voter list. Mayor Reed, I'm curious, how do people vote in Montgomery? Is mail-in popular?
Well, we don't have mail-in voting here in Alabama.
Well, then I guess it's not popular.
I think it would be well received, and I think there again are reasons why certain states and certain parts of this country have been more open to this idea than others. I don't think that's by accident. And I think that, here we've seen our early voting hours reduced, and we've seen also some of the rules changed to our absentee voting as well. So we've seen that change happen over the last few years. And unfortunately, that drives some of the questions around the election process that you were talking about with Commissioner Hicks, is when people who are outside of government, people who are not familiar with it, see rules being changed midstream, then they start to wonder whether or not there's something suspicious about the whole process itself. And I think those are some of the mechanisms we're trying to combat by trying to expose some of it, but also share the background and the current operations around elections, around the security of voting, as well as what people can do to get engaged and get inspired to create some change themselves right where they live.
So, Mayor, I see that the Alabama Secretary of State has just announced a bipartisan voter fraud task force. It even includes the Southern Poverty Law Center, which has been pretty critical of the things that Alabama has been passing into law. Are you optimistic about this? What do you think the outcome might be?
Well, they say when you don't want to make a decision, what do? You give it to a committee. So, my question is this just for pomp and circumstance, or what's the goal and objective of this? I think the evidence is pretty clear that voter fraud is infested here in our elections. That has been shown by so many outside organizations. I don't know what the need is for an additional committee to come together as if there's a real problem. This is a solution in search of a problem. And so I'm skeptical of that. Ultimately, what I'm more concerned about is what the legislature does and what's introduced there, because I think those are some of the actions that many people don't quite know about that are happening in their state capitals. And those are the things we really have to watch with a lot of vigilance.
And tell me specifically one or two things the legislature is contemplating that really has you alarmed.
Well, I think certainly, again, the issues around absentee voting. For us, it's a major issue when you get out in the rural areas and you deal with the way that people cast absentee ballots here. That is a major issue here in the state of Alabama. It's a major issue here in Montgomery County where I live. And so that's probably the biggest issue. And just the second piece probably would be just the resistance to early voting. Again, if we want to encourage people to participate in the process, why don't we make that easier? And there seem to be all these false misnomers around early voting, which have prevented that ever since 2008. And so we're still seeing that in our legislature, and those are the issues that we have to address. Unfortunately, in our state, we don't have a filibuster-proof minority. And so the Republican side can pretty much introduce a bill and they can pass without any Democratic legislation whatsoever. And there have been very few Republicans who've been willing to look at things outside of a partisan mindset. And that is problematic for this process. And again, I think that drives some of the questions around the elections and the integrity of elections and those outcomes.
Secretary Hobbs, let me talk to you about some of the legislation in Arizona. One bill states that the legislature may revoke the Secretary of State's issuance or certification of a presidential elector's certificate of election. What does that represent?
Well, thank goodness that bill did not even get a hearing in Arizona, but I think it does represent this alarming trend that we're seeing in election-related legislation across the country, particularly after this last election, that allows partisan officials to insert themselves in a process that has been inherently nonpartisan and conducted by election professionals, whether those election professionals are elected or appointed, but in inserting themselves to overturn the will of the people. Essentially, this is alarming. It is not isolated to Arizona. We're seeing it in these kind of legislative actions, but also people who are running for these positions like Secretary of State and other local election officials.
We heard Commissioner Hicks in the first panel say he didn't think this was problematic, that he still had confidence in the integrity of election officials. Do you disagree?
Well, I think this is an alarming trend, certainly, but our system of government also has a lot of checks and balances built into it. I think right now we're seeing those checks and balances being tested to their extreme limits, and it requires us all to continue to be vigilant and ensure that those checks and balances are working, and that partisan people with a partisan agenda aren't allowed to just insert their own will in substitute of the will of the people.
Amber, did you want to weigh in on that, having been a local election official?
Yeah, I think the harassment and attacks of election officials is one of our great security risks and threats. I do think there's a move to insert more partisan officials. So I do think we have to think about governance changes at the federal, state, and local level to insulate our election infrastructure from those partisan actors, because partisan politics has no place in election administration. I often say this to folks when they're considering policy changes. Policies have to be fair, accessible, secure, transparent, equitable, and reliable. I call that faster. You have to have faster election administration, and all of those values matter. And right now we're seeing people kind of cherry pick election security to reduce access. And that just doesn't work, because that doesn't put voters first. It doesn't prioritize the voting populace, which is what we are here to be doing whether they're election officials or folks that work in the space. That's the goal, is to empower voters with options and accomplish all those values collectively, not kind of in silos. They all work together and they all complement each other to create good systems.
There are, of course, a couple of federal voting laws pending in Congress. It doesn't look like they're going to make it through. How do you feel about those laws, Amber? Do you think that they should be passed in order to provide that insulation that you referred to for elections and election officials?
Yeah, I do. I certainly think that many of the pending federal bills are critical for us to, number one, standardize practices across the country. I think part of the reason disinformation is flying about as it is because the rules of engagement vary by state and sometimes even vary by jurisdiction within states. So I do think that stabilizing some of that will actually help with disinformation and make our elections more secure. I also think we need to add protections for voters and protections for election officials. And I work to insert legislation or language into one of the bills to protect election officials, because I do think that we need to do far more to protect them and protect the providers of technology in the critical infrastructure domain, which just was designated 5 years ago. So it's a new process with critical infrastructure, and we got to protect the people, the process, the technology, and the physical structures within that process. So I do think that there does need to be some federal baseline legislation to ensure that voters are protected and also election offices are protected. And then the states run it from there. You know, this isn't a federal takeover of elections, as many people say. Most states already do what's actually in the bills that are being proposed. So, you know, it is not a federal takeover by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think it would help with the security of our elections.
Mayor Reed, Secretary Hobbs, would you agree with that assessment?
I agree.
Secretary Hobbs, let me ask you about infrastructure. Your state had to spend, what, $3 million replacing election machines that had been compromised because they were in the control of firms that weren't accredited to be handling them. Remind us what that story was and what the implications of that are.
Sure. So this was part of the Maricopa County partisan election review that was conducted. And, part of what was subpoenaed by the Senate was the election equipment utilized in the 2020 election. And my office worked with Maricopa County, warned them and said, look, if you lose the chain of custody of these machines and they go into the hands of these unqualified individuals who are not certified election officials, that's going to be a problem, and we're probably going to have to decertify them. And so it's not even the fact that we don't know if these machines were compromised or not. It's that the chain of custody was lost. And this is based on guidance from the EAC and from CISA about the handling of election equipment. And so that chain of custody by certified election officials is so critical, and part of the checks and balances and security measures that we have in place to ensure security of our elections. And so that was the issue here, not what the cyber ninjas may or may not have done to the equipment. It's just that physical chain of custody is so critical.
So you had rules in place, the chain of custody was still broken. How do you prevent this from happening in the future?
Well, secretaries of state and other election officials have been having conversations about this kind of sham election review, and how do we prevent them? And Arizona seemed to be the test case for that. Obviously, they're trying to take these to other states. I encouraged other states, if you have a legislature that's looking at your post-election auditing processes, try to legislate preventative measures that would prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future. This whole review was based on the broad subpoena authority that the courts gave to the legislature or acknowledged that the legislature had, but none of this chain of custody should have ever been lost. And I'm hopeful that a future legislature, instead of encouraging this kind of thing that undermines our democratic processes to continue, would put safeguards in place so that it doesn't happen in Arizona again.
There are those who theorize that the challenges in Arizona and elsewhere are all part of a concerted effort not to change what happened in 2020 necessarily, but to lay the groundwork for challenging the results in 2022 and 2024. I'd love to poll all three of you about what you think of that theory. Mayor, can we start with you?
I don't put anything past those who are dissatisfied with the direction this country is going, with the makeup of the electorate and what they perceive as their birthright when it comes to making decisions and charting the direction of this nation. So as I sit here in Montgomery, Alabama, again, I understand that the history and the struggle for voting rights. And as I have seen voting take on a different temperature since 2008 in the election of President Barack Obama, I believe that anything is possible. And I think that we should approach it from the perspective of there is an effort, there is a strategy to not only undermine things at the federal level, but even at the state and local level. And I'm glad that Commissioner Hicks feels confident in the security of the process. I feel confident in those that are working as election officials across both parties. I found tremendous professionals in that realm, but I also know that there are bad actors out there, and they aren't all overseas. Many are domestic, and I think we should take that approach as we look at how to encourage more confidence in the system as well as more participation.
Amber McReynolds, what do you think? Is this all about 2022 and 2024?
I think that perhaps elements of it are. I do think that in a way, 2020 and some of the disinformation, it almost felt like things were being thrown at the wall to see what would stick. So I don't think it was necessarily strategic, but I do think now going forward, these sorts of tactics are going to be used. This was a playbook. This was how much access can we get in Arizona kind of conversation is really what I think a lot of these bad actors, and that's exactly what they are. And we've even seen a few examples of folks within. So a clerk in Colorado, for instance, gave information she should not have under her oath away. And so we have to make sure that we've got a system that protects itself from bad actors within or without, and make sure there's accountability, and transparency is one of the ways to really achieve that, making ballot operations more transparent, all of that. But I also think that we can't forget, with record turnout in 2020, still more than a third of the eligible voters did not vote in this country in the most highly anticipated election of our time. And so I often say to people, yes, let's focus on who voted, but what are we going to do about all the people that didn't vote? And how do we make sure they have access, they have the education they need, and really improve our civic health as a part of all of this, not just the fighting over whether or not it's voter fraud or it's suppression or it's this or it's that. I mean, we really need to look at this system as a whole and focus on those voters that didn't engage and figure out why, to improve our overall civic health and the health of our democracy.
And while we're on that point, why aren't they engaged? Do you have a theory?
Well, so the surveys, the limited number of surveys that have been done on non-voters, the top issues are around barriers. They missed a deadline to register to vote. They didn't get to sign up for a ballot. They were out of town on work. They were working a 12-hour shift on election day and couldn't get an absentee ballot in their state. There's all kinds of reasons they miss, and frankly, a lot of that is because the process is not clear. or it varies by state, or it's one thing in one state, it's something in somewhere else. And then there's a second set of people that didn't have enough information to make a decision, and they've said that. So for me, that's like, okay, well, what do we need to do to engage these voters that are not voting? Where are the areas of the country where that really matters? And I do think on the access front, just to say something finally, the states with the highest turnout have the most accessible voting laws. Colorado is the second highest in the country. Minnesota is the highest. Oregon and Washington are in there. Arizona is up there. Utah is now up there because they've expanded options. I mean, the states that are in the top 10 list every single time have made voting more accessible and have commonalities. Same day registration, vote by mail, have those commonalities. So policies matter. And then the second piece is civics education and civic health, and really reaching those people that aren't engaging.
I do want to drive this to solutions. And so Secretary Hobbs, how worried are you about 22, 24, and what do you think has to be done between now and then to create more secure and trusted election infrastructure?
Well, I think it's really critical as part of the toolbox that we are investing in robust public education campaigns. Unfortunately, oftentimes it's an area that there's not enough investment in. And we saw some foundations step up during the last election to try to provide some of the funding to fill those gaps. And different partisan legislatures have attacked that. And so now in Arizona, we won't be able to accept those funds if they're available in the future, but there continues to be a lack of investment there. And so I can tell you that for my office, continued public education and access to information is going to be a top priority. We're going to figure out how to get it done with the resources we have, and also work to amplify the information coming out of the local election offices as well. I think that is such a critical piece of how we combat misinformation and also provide voters information on how they can access their freedom to vote and participate in the process.
Mayor Reed, I'm going to give you the last word. If you could wave that magic wand and do one thing that would improve security and improve access, what would it be?
Well, I think Secretary Hobbs laid out a lot that I agree with. I think, from my standpoint, what we want to do to improve access is to make it easier for people to register to vote, to make it easier for them to vote overall. And I think in terms of the security, I think we've got to make sure that we aren't allowing that to become politicized as we have with so many other things in this day and age. And we've got to continue to work to the better angels and people who are the election officials, and to make sure that they understand this is not about who wins or who loses. It's about this nation and this democracy being able to go from one election to the next with the confidence and the appreciation of all of our citizens that we represent.
Mayor Reed, Amber McReynolds, and Secretary Hobbs, thank you, all three of you, for joining us here today. I'm very appreciative. And that concludes our episode on election security. Thank you to all of you who did participate today. Our next episode is going to cover something that came up repeatedly with this panel and the earlier panel, and that is civic education. That panel is going to air on October 28th. The series is free. It is open to the public. Our hashtag, by the way, is #DemocracyReimagined, and you can register to attend our next episode at reimaginingdemocracy.org. I'm Jeanne Meserve. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.